In the dark days of 1942, when the Pacific Ocean burned with the fires of war and the fate of nations hung by a thread, a ship that should have been dead returned to battle like a phantom from beyond the grave. The Japanese admirals believed they had sent her to the bottom of the Coral Sea, torn apart and sinking beneath the waves. Yet mere weeks later she appeared at Midway Island as if summoned by magic or desperation or perhaps both. This is not a tale of supernatural forces, but something far more remarkable. A story of human determination so fierce and engineering genius so extraordinary that it defied every rule of warfare and every expectation of what was possible. The USS Yorktown became a ghost ship not because she was destroyed, but because she refused to die, and in her refusal to surrender to fate, she helped turn the tide of the entire Pacific War in 72 impossible hours that no one believed could happen. The men who worked on her spoke of miracles. The Japanese intelligence officers who studied reconnaissance photographs could not believe their eyes. The American commanders who needed her knew they were asking for the impossible, yet they asked anyway because there was no choice, no alternative, no other path to victory. This is the story of how a wounded warship became a symbol of defiance, how a floating city of steel and courage defied death itself, and how the impossible became real in the most desperate hour of America's greatest naval war. Before she became a legend, before she became a ghost, the USS Yorktown was already one of the most important ships in the United States Navy, a carrier that represented the cutting edge of American naval power in the years leading up to World War II. She was laid down in May of 1934 at the Newport News Shipbuilding Company in Virginia, launched in April of 1936, and commissioned into service in September of 1937. At over 800 feet long and displacing more than 25,000 tons when fully loaded, she was a floating fortress designed to project American air power across vast ocean distances. Her flight deck stretched across her entire length, and she could carry more than 90 aircraft including fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes that could strike enemy targets hundreds of miles away. The Yorktown was named after the Revolutionary War battle where American forces had surrendered to the British in 1781, a curious choice that reflected the Navy's tradition of remembering both victories and defeats as lessons for future generations. She was the lead ship of her class, which also included the USS Enterprise and the USS Hornet, and together these carriers would form the backbone of American naval aviation in the Pacific. Her crew numbered more than 2,000 men when fully staffed, creating a small city at sea with its own workshops, hospitals, kitchens, and living quarters. Every system aboard her represented the finest technology America could produce in the late 1930s, from her powerful steam turbines that could push her through the water at nearly 33 knots to her sophisticated damage control systems designed to keep her afloat even when badly damaged. In the years before Pearl Harbor, the Yorktown conducted training exercises throughout the Atlantic and Caribbean, preparing her crew for the war that many suspected was coming. Her pilots practiced carrier landings and takeoffs until these dangerous maneuvers became second nature. Her gunners drilled endlessly on their anti-aircraft weapons. Her damage control teams rehearsed emergency procedures for fires, flooding, and battle damage. When war finally came to America on December 7, 1941, the Yorktown was in the Atlantic, but she was quickly ordered through the Panama Canal and into the Pacific Theater where she would face the greatest challenge of her existence. To understand why the Yorktown's survival became so desperately important, we must understand the terrifying situation facing America in the early months of 1942. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had devastated the American battleship fleet, sending 8 battleships to the bottom or leaving them burning and broken in the shallow waters of the harbor. For generations, naval planners had believed that battleships were the ultimate measure of naval power, the steel titans that would decide the fate of any war at sea. In a single morning, the Japanese had proven that aircraft carriers were now the true queens of naval warfare, and they had done so while leaving America's carrier fleet largely untouched only because those carriers happened to be at sea during the attack. But surviving the attack on Pearl Harbor did not mean America was in any position to fight back. The Japanese military machine was rampaging across the Pacific with a speed and ferocity that shocked the world. They captured Wake Island, overran the Philippines, seized Singapore from the British, and pushed deep into the Dutch East Indies and New Guinea. Their carrier fleet, hardened by years of combat in China and equipped with some of the finest naval aircraft in the world, seemed unstoppable. American forces fell back again and again, trying desperately to establish some defensive line that could hold against the Japanese advance. Every carrier America possessed became absolutely precious because there were so few of them, and because without carriers, the vast distances of the Pacific could not be crossed by American air power. The Yorktown arrived in the Pacific just in time to participate in some of America's first attempts to strike back at the Japanese advance. In February of 1942, she participated in raids on Japanese positions in the Marshall and Gilbert Islands, showing the Japanese that American carriers were still in the fight. In March, she supported operations in New Guinea, and her aircraft helped turn back a Japanese invasion fleet attempting to capture Port Moresby. These were small victories compared to the tide of Japanese conquests, but they were victories nonetheless, tiny pinpricks of resistance that showed the Japanese that their advance would not go unchallenged. With each operation, the Yorktown's crew grew more experienced, more confident, and more skilled at the deadly art of carrier warfare. In early May of 1942, American intelligence detected that the Japanese were preparing another major operation aimed at Port Moresby in New Guinea, and this time they were sending a powerful invasion force protected by not one but two fleet carriers. The Americans decided to challenge this invasion with the only carriers they could spare in that part of the Pacific, the Yorktown and the Lexington. What followed was the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first naval battle in history where the opposing ships never actually saw each other, with all the fighting done by aircraft launched from carriers that remained over the horizon from one another. It was a new kind of warfare, and both sides were still learning the rules. The battle raged across May 7th and 8th, with American and Japanese aircraft searching vast expanses of ocean for enemy carriers, then launching strikes whenever they found their targets. The Yorktown's dive bombers and torpedo planes helped sink the light carrier Shoho on the 7th, and the American pilots radioed back the jubilant message that would become famous throughout the fleet. On the 8th, the main carrier forces finally found each other, and a massive exchange of airstrikes followed. Japanese aircraft found the Lexington and the Yorktown, while American planes found the Japanese carriers Shikaku and Zuikaku. Bombs and torpedoes flew through walls of anti-aircraft fire as pilots pressed home their attacks with desperate courage. The Yorktown was hit by a single heavy bomb that penetrated deep into her interior before exploding. The blast tore through 3 decks, killed and wounded dozens of men, and started fierce fires in the spaces below. For a moment, it seemed the Grand Carrier might be doomed, but her damage control teams responded with trained efficiency that would have amazed observers who had never seen such procedures in action. They isolated the damaged sections, flooded magazines to prevent explosions, fought the fires with foam and water, and shored up weakened structures. Within hours, the fires were out and temporary repairs were underway. The Yorktown could still operate her aircraft, still make good speed, and still fight. The Lexington was not so fortunate. Multiple torpedo and bomb hits overwhelmed her damage control capabilities, and internal gasoline explosions eventually forced her crew to abandon ship. She was scuttled by American destroyers to prevent her capture, a devastating loss for the small American carrier fleet. The Battle of the Coral Sea ended as a tactical draw but a strategic American victory. The Japanese invasion of Port Moresby was turned back, never to be attempted again by sea. However, the Americans had lost the Lexington, and the Yorktown was damaged and limping back toward Pearl Harbor, trailing an oil slick and nursing wounds that would normally require months in a shipyard to repair. To the Japanese, the Yorktown appeared to be out of action for the foreseeable future, possibly sunk, certainly badly damaged enough to remove her from the next phase of operations. American intelligence analysts studying Japanese radio traffic began to detect signs of another major operation being planned, something even larger than the Coral Sea battle, something that would require every carrier the Americans could muster. The problem was that they did not have enough carriers, not if the Yorktown was out of the fight. When the Yorktown limped into Pearl Harbor on May 27, 1942, her damage was evident to everyone who saw her. The bomb hit from Coral Sea had torn a massive hole in her flight deck, damaged her structural integrity, and left her with a worrying list to port. Black smoke stains streaked her island superstructure. Her crew was exhausted from days of continuous combat operations followed by the desperate voyage home. Under normal peacetime conditions, repairing such damage would require at least 3 months in a fully equipped naval shipyard, possibly longer if detailed inspections revealed additional problems hidden beneath the obvious damage. The standard procedure would be to dry dock the ship, strip away damaged sections, carefully assess every system, order new parts from factories on the mainland, and rebuild the damaged areas to full strength. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, did not have 3 months. He did not have 3 weeks. American codebreakers had confirmed that the Japanese were planning a major operation against Midway Island, a tiny atoll roughly halfway across the Pacific that served as an outer defensive position for Hawaii. The Japanese intended to seize Midway and draw out the American carrier fleet for a decisive battle that would destroy America's ability to contest Japanese control of the Pacific. Nimitz knew the Japanese were coming, knew approximately when they would arrive, and knew that he needed every single carrier he could possibly put to sea if he was going to have any chance of winning the engagement. The Enterprise and Hornet were available, but 2 carriers against the 4 or 5 carriers the Japanese would bring might not be enough. He needed the Yorktown, needed her desperately, and he needed her in days, not months. Nimitz went aboard the damaged carrier and asked her captain and chief engineer a question that must have seemed insane. Could they make her ready for combat operations in 3 days? The shipyard commander estimated that emergency repairs might be possible in 2 weeks if they worked around the clock and cut every possible corner. Nimitz said they did not have 2 weeks. They had 72 hours. Get her ready to fight in 72 hours or America might lose the coming battle and with it possibly the war in the Pacific. The men who heard this order understood they were being asked to do the impossible, but they also understood that impossible was the only option available. Work began immediately even before the Yorktown was fully secured to the dock. What happened next at Pearl Harbor between May 27th and May 30th, 1942, defied every standard of shipbuilding and repair work known to the naval engineering profession. 1,400 workers from the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard swarmed aboard the Yorktown while she was still settling into her berth. They brought welding equipment, cutting torches, replacement steel plates, timber for shoring, tools of every description, and a determination to accomplish in 3 days what should have taken 3 months. There was no time for careful assessment, no time for engineering studies, no time for anything except action. Damaged sections of the flight deck were cut away with torches while the metal was still warm. New steel plates were measured, cut, and welded into place even as other work crews continued cutting away other damaged areas nearby. The workers operated in shifts around the clock with lights blazing across the ship at all hours. Some men worked until they collapsed from exhaustion and were carried off to be replaced by fresh workers. The noise was deafening as dozens of welding torches, pneumatic hammers, and cutting saws all operated simultaneously. Sparks showered down into the spaces below where other crews were repairing damaged electrical systems, replacing buckled support beams, and patching holes in fuel tanks. The entire operation had to be choreographed carefully because the wrong sequence of repairs could actually make things worse or create dangerous situations. Welding near fuel systems required those systems to be completely purged. Cutting into bulkheads required knowing what was on the other side. Every decision had to be made quickly because there was no time for hesitation or second-guessing. The flight deck damage was patched rather than fully repaired. Instead of removing all the damaged structure and replacing it with properly engineered components, the workers simply cut away the worst of the damage and welded in replacement plates that were good enough to land aircraft on. They knew these patches would not hold up to heavy seas or sustained operations, but they would be adequate for one more battle. The structural damage below decks received similar emergency treatment. Weakened beams were shored up with timber rather than replaced. Bent frames were reinforced rather than cut out and rebuilt. The goal was not to restore the Yorktown to perfect condition but to make her strong enough to fight one more time. Every man working on the ship understood that they were building something temporary, something that might not survive much additional damage, but that was a problem for later. The immediate problem was getting her ready to sail in 72 hours. Throughout the repair work, the Yorktown's own crew remained aboard, working alongside the Navy Yard personnel. They loaded ammunition, took on fuel and aviation gasoline, conducted maintenance on the aircraft that would fly from her deck, tested guns and fire control systems, and prepared their ship for battle. New pilots reported aboard to replace those lost at Coral Sea. Additional anti-aircraft guns were installed wherever space could be found, because everyone knew that Japanese aircraft would be coming for the carriers at Midway. Supplies of every kind were loaded aboard, from food for the crew to spare parts for the aircraft to medical supplies for the inevitable casualties. The ship had to be transformed from a battle-damaged wreck into a fully functional combat vessel in just 3 days. On the morning of May 30th, 72 hours after the repair work had begun, the USS Yorktown cast off her lines and steamed out of Pearl Harbor. She was not fully repaired. She still had workers from the Navy Yard aboard who would continue making improvements even as she sailed toward battle. Her flight deck patches were rough and unfinished. Her internal structure was held together in places by temporary shoring that would never pass a peacetime inspection. But she could launch and recover aircraft. She could make good speed. Her guns could shoot. Her crew was ready for battle. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who had commanded the Yorktown at Coral Sea, would fly his flag from her once again. The ship that the Japanese believed they had knocked out of the war was steaming toward them like a ghost returning from the dead. The repair workers who had accomplished this impossible feat stood on the dock and watched her go, many of them still covered in grime and exhausted beyond description. They had worked without rest, without adequate breaks, without any of the safety margins or quality controls that normally govern shipyard work. They had improvised solutions to problems that did not have textbook answers. They had taken risks that could have resulted in equipment failures or structural collapses, but they had done it. They had returned a wounded carrier to combat capability in 1/20th of the time normally required, and in doing so they had given Admiral Nimitz the 3-carrier force he needed for the desperate battle ahead. None of them knew if their hasty repairs would hold up under combat conditions. None of them knew if the Yorktown would survive the coming fight. All they knew was that they had done everything humanly possible to give her and her crew a fighting chance. As the Yorktown steamed northwest toward Midway, her crew completed their battle preparations. Aircraft were armed and fueled. Damage control teams reviewed their procedures and pre-positioned firefighting equipment. Gunners fired their weapons. The ship's company knew they were heading into a major engagement because Admiral Nimitz had been unusually forthcoming about the intelligence assessments of Japanese intentions. The crew also knew their ship was not at full strength, that she was being held together by emergency repairs that might not survive another bomb hit. But they had confidence in their vessel and in each other, confidence built through months of combat operations and earned through their survival at Coral Sea. If the Yorktown was ready to fight again, then they were ready to fight with her. Midway Atoll sits almost exactly halfway between Asia and North America, a tiny ring of sand and coral surrounding a lagoon in the vastness of the Pacific Ocean. In 1942, it was home to a small American garrison, an airfield and facilities that made it a useful forward base for patrol aircraft and submarines. Strategically, Midway was important not because of what it contained, but because of where it was located. In American hands, it served as an outer defensive position for Hawaii and a base for operations against Japanese territory. In Japanese hands, it would provide them with a forward position threatening Hawaii and would eliminate an American base that could harass their operations throughout the Central Pacific. But beyond its strategic value, Midway was important to the Japanese for another reason. They believed that by attacking Midway, they could draw out the American carrier fleet and destroy it in a decisive battle. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander of the Japanese combined fleet and the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had planned the Midway operation as a trap. He would send a powerful striking force including 4 fleet carriers to attack Midway itself, and when the American carriers sortied from Pearl Harbor to defend the atoll, they would sail into a carefully prepared ambush. Yamamoto had gathered the most powerful naval force in Japanese history for this operation, including not just the 4 carriers of the First Air Fleet, but also battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and invasion forces to occupy Midway once the American fleet was destroyed. Japanese intelligence estimated that the Americans had at most 2 carriers available, the Enterprise and Hornet, since the Yorktown had been badly damaged at Coral Sea and the Lexington had been sunk. 4 Japanese carriers against 2 American carriers seemed like overwhelming odds. What the Japanese did not know was that American codebreakers had penetrated their naval codes and knew almost everything about the planned operation. Admiral Nimitz knew the Japanese were coming. He knew they would attack on June 4th. He knew they would approach from the northwest. He knew the composition of their forces. This intelligence advantage gave him the opportunity to set his own trap, to position his carriers northeast of Midway where they could ambush the Japanese when the enemy carriers were most vulnerable. But even with this intelligence advantage, Nimitz was still outnumbered. The Japanese would have 4 fleet carriers with far more aircraft and more experienced pilots. Nimitz would have 3 carriers, and one of them was the barely repaired Yorktown that might fall apart under the stress of combat operations. It would be the closest thing to an even fight that either side could manage, and the outcome would likely determine the course of the entire Pacific War. On June 2, 1942, the 3 American carriers and their escort ships reached a position northeast of Midway that had been designated Point Luck. Admiral Fletcher aboard the Yorktown commanded the overall force, while Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded the Enterprise and Hornet in a separate task force. The 2 groups would operate in close coordination, but far enough apart that a single Japanese attack could not cripple both American formations. Now came the hardest part of any military operation, the waiting. The American ships maintained radio silence, patrolling slowly through an empty ocean while their crews remained at heightened alert. Aircraft were kept ready for immediate launch. Scouts searched the skies for any sign of approaching Japanese planes. The waiting was nerve-wracking because any moment might bring the sudden cry of contact followed by the desperate scramble to launch aircraft and defend against incoming attacks. Meanwhile, Japanese submarines that were supposed to form a picket line to detect the American carriers moving out from Pearl Harbor arrived at their stations too late. The American carriers were already at sea, already in position, and the Japanese had no idea they were there. Japanese reconnaissance from the Marshall Islands had failed to detect the American movement. Japanese commanders proceeded with their operation believing their intelligence was accurate, believing they knew where the Americans were and what forces they possessed. The ghost carrier sailing toward them remained invisible to their awareness. On the morning of June 4th, the Japanese carriers approached Midway from the northwest and launched a massive strike against the island's defenses. More than 100 aircraft roared off the flight decks of the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Huryu to bomb the American facilities on Midway. The strike achieved tactical success, damaging the airfield and installations, but the Japanese strike commander radioed back that another attack would be necessary to fully neutralize Midway's defenses. Aboard the Japanese carriers, this message created a critical dilemma. The strike aircraft being held in reserve on the carrier decks had been armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for attacking ships because the Japanese knew the American carriers were somewhere in the area. Now the strike commander was requesting another attack on land targets, which would require different weapons, high-explosive bombs and fragmentation bombs rather than anti-ship weapons. The Japanese commanders made the fateful decision to rearm their reserve aircraft for a second strike on Midway, while Japanese deck crews frantically worked to remove torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs from their reserve aircraft and replace them with land attack weapons. American scout planes found the Japanese carriers. The electrifying message flashed back to the American carriers. Contact. Enemy carriers located. This was the moment Admiral Fletcher and Admiral Spruance had been waiting for. Despite being outnumbered in carriers and aircraft, despite the inexperience of many American pilots compared to Japanese veterans, despite the uncertain condition of the Yorktown's hasty repairs, the Americans had achieved surprise and now held the initiative. Spruance made the aggressive decision to launch immediately with everything he had, to strike at maximum range rather than waiting to close the distance, because he understood that hitting the Japanese carriers while they were rearming their aircraft could catch them at their most vulnerable. The American strike was chaotic and uncoordinated, everything that military planners hoped to avoid. Squadrons from different carriers lost contact with each other during the flight to the target. Fighters that were supposed to escort the bombers got separated and ended up flying to the wrong locations. Torpedo bombers that needed fighter cover found themselves attacking alone against overwhelming Japanese defenses. The results were catastrophic for the torpedo squadrons. Wave after wave of slow, low-flying American torpedo bombers pressed home their attacks with extraordinary courage, and wave after wave of them were shot down by Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Entire squadrons were wiped out. Of the 41 torpedo bombers that attacked the Japanese carriers that morning, only 6 survived, and none of their torpedoes hit anything. The sacrifice of the torpedo bomber crews seemed to have achieved nothing except their own deaths, but their sacrifice had achieved something crucial even if they did not live to see it. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, the fighters circling above the carriers to defend them against attack, had been pulled down to low altitude chasing the torpedo bombers. When the American dive bombers finally arrived over the Japanese fleet, minutes after the last torpedo attack had been shot down, they found the Japanese carriers in the worst possible situation. The Japanese carriers had aircraft spotted on their decks ready for launch, loaded with fuel and armed with bombs. Their combat air patrol was out of position at low altitude. Their anti-aircraft gunners were looking in the wrong direction. The American dive bombers pushed over into their attacks almost unopposed. The Yorktown's air group had maintained better cohesion during the approach than the other American squadrons, and when her dive bombers arrived over the Japanese fleet, they selected the carrier Soryu as their target. The American pilots rolled into nearly vertical dives, pushing their aircraft to dangerous speeds as they plummeted toward the enemy carrier below. Japanese anti-aircraft fire began to find the range, black bursts of flak exploding among the diving aircraft, but momentum was on the American side now. The Yorktown's bombers scored 3 direct hits on the Soryu in a matter of minutes. The bombs penetrated deep into the carrier's interior where they exploded among armed and fueled aircraft, touching off a cascade of secondary explosions and fires that quickly spread out of control. The Soryu, one of the elite carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor, was transformed into a blazing wreck in less than 5 minutes. Simultaneously, dive bombers from the Enterprise attacked the Akagi and Kaga. The Akagi took at least 1 direct hit that detonated among the aircraft being rearmed on her hangar deck, triggering massive explosions and uncontrollable fires. The Kaga suffered multiple hits that turned her into an inferno. In the span of just 5 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese fleet carriers had been mortally wounded by American dive bombers who had arrived at exactly the right moment to exploit the vulnerability created by the torpedo bombers' sacrifice. The Japanese carriers burned fiercely, their fuel and ammunition cooking off in tremendous explosions that sent flames hundreds of feet into the air. Damage control efforts proved futile against fires fed by aviation gasoline and detonating ordnance. One by one, the 3 carriers would be abandoned and eventually sink or be scuttled, but 1 Japanese carrier remained untouched. The Huryu had been separated from the other 3 carriers during the morning operations, and the American dive bombers had not found her. When word reached the Huryu's commander that the other 3 carriers had been destroyed, he immediately ordered strikes launched against the American carriers using every aircraft he had available. Japanese scouts had finally located the American fleet, and now the Huryu's aircraft headed northeast to exact revenge for the devastation inflicted on the Japanese carrier force. The battle was not over, and the Yorktown, the ghost carrier that should not have been there, was about to face her greatest test. The Yorktown's radar picked up the incoming Japanese strike while it was still over 30 miles away, providing precious minutes of warning. Admiral Fletcher ordered his ships to prepare for air attack while every available fighter was scrambled to intercept the incoming bombers. The Yorktown's combat air patrol, supplemented by fighters from the Enterprise that had been orbiting nearby, climbed to meet the Japanese attack. High above the carrier, American Wildcat fighters tore into the incoming Japanese formation, shooting down several bombers before they could reach their target. More Japanese aircraft fell to the intense anti-aircraft fire thrown up by the Yorktown and her escorting ships, but some Japanese bombers got through the defenses. The Yorktown's captain maneuvered his ship violently, throwing the massive carrier into sharp turns to avoid the bombs falling around her. Near misses threw up towering columns of water that drenched the flight deck. Then 3 bombs hit the carrier in rapid succession. One bomb exploded on the flight deck, tearing another massive hole in the wooden planking and steel plates beneath. A second bomb penetrated into the ship's interior before exploding, starting fires in the spaces below. A third bomb went deeper still, exploding near the ship's engineering spaces and rupturing vital systems. The Yorktown shuddered under the impacts, and for a moment it seemed the hasty repairs from Pearl Harbor would fail under this new assault. But once again, the Yorktown's damage control teams proved their worth. They fought the fires with the same trained efficiency they had shown at Coral Sea. They shored up damaged structures, isolated flooded compartments, and restored power to vital systems. The ship slowed but did not stop. The fires were brought under control. Within an hour, the Yorktown was recovering aircraft again, still in the fight despite 3 bomb hits that would have crippled a less well-designed or less well-handled ship. The temporary repairs from Pearl Harbor had been good enough to keep the carrier fighting even when struck by Japanese bombs. The ghost carrier refused to die. Late in the afternoon of June 4th, while the Yorktown's crew was still dealing with the damage from the morning bomb hits, radar detected another incoming strike from the Huryu. The Japanese had found them again, and this time the attack would be even more dangerous because it consisted of torpedo bombers rather than dive bombers. Torpedoes striking below the waterline could inflict catastrophic flooding that was much harder to contain than the damage from bombs exploding above the waterline. Once again, every available fighter scrambled to intercept. Once again, anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with defensive fire. Once again, Japanese pilots pressed home their attacks with suicidal determination against overwhelming opposition. The Yorktown was still making only about 20 knots, much slower than her normal top speed, because of damage to her engineering systems from the morning attack. This reduced speed made her more vulnerable because she could not maneuver as rapidly to avoid torpedoes. 2 Japanese torpedoes struck her port side almost simultaneously. The twin underwater explosions tore massive holes in the carrier's hull below the waterline. Water poured into the ship's interior, dragging her down and causing her to list heavily to port. Power failed throughout most of the vessel. Pumps stopped working. Lights went out. The list increased to dangerous angles where men and equipment began sliding across tilted decks. The Yorktown, which had survived so much, finally seemed doomed. Admiral Fletcher transferred his flag to a cruiser because the Yorktown could no longer serve as an effective command post with power and communications disrupted. The carrier's captain ordered all non-essential personnel to abandon ship as the list continued to increase past 26 degrees. Hundreds of sailors slid down lines into the water or onto the decks of destroyers that had closed alongside to take off survivors. The Yorktown rolled slowly in the gentle swells, seemingly on the verge of capsizing and sinking. It appeared that the ghost carrier had fought her last battle, that the temporary repairs from Pearl Harbor had finally given way, that the ship that should have been in a shipyard for months was going to sink after all. But even now, even on the edge of capsizing, the Yorktown refused to die quickly. Throughout the night of June 4th and into June 5th, the Yorktown remained afloat despite her terrible wounds. The list stabilized at about 26 degrees, not worsening but not improving either. Salvage experts studying the situation realized the carrier might actually be saved if they could get pumps aboard, counterflood some compartments to reduce the list, and tow her back to Pearl Harbor. A small group of volunteers led by the Yorktown's captain returned aboard the abandoned carrier on June 5th to attempt salvage operations. They rigged tow lines to a destroyer. They started portable pumps working to remove water from flooded compartments. They fought small fires that had continued to smolder in unmanned spaces. Slowly, incredibly, the list began to decrease as water was pumped out and weight redistributed. For a time it seemed the Yorktown might actually make it back to Pearl Harbor for proper repairs. She was badly damaged, would require months of work to restore, but she was still afloat and now under tow. The salvage crews worked through June 5th making progress against the flooding and fires. But they did not know that a Japanese submarine had been drawn to the area by the smoke and activity around the wounded carrier. The submarine I-168 had penetrated through the destroyer screen protecting the Yorktown and taken up a firing position. Early in the morning of June 6th, the submarine launched a spread of torpedoes at the crippled carrier and the destroyer alongside her. 2 more torpedoes slammed into the Yorktown's hull, tearing new holes in her already damaged structure. Another torpedo struck the destroyer Hammond, which had been providing power to the carrier's pumps, breaking her in half and sinking her in minutes with heavy loss of life. The new torpedo hits finally overwhelmed the Yorktown's ability to survive. Water poured into spaces that had previously remained dry. The list, which had been slowly decreasing, suddenly increased again. The salvage crews realized there was nothing more they could do and abandoned ship for the second time. Throughout June 6th, the Yorktown continued to settle lower in the water, rolling slowly, taking on the appearance of a dying creature struggling for one last breath. On the morning of June 7, 1942, 3 days after the Great Battle had begun, the USS Yorktown finally capsized and sank. She rolled over slowly, almost gently, her flight deck disappearing beneath the waves, her island superstructure sliding into the ocean, her massive hull following until nothing remained visible but disturbed water and floating debris. 2,000 sailors watched from nearby destroyers as their ship, their home, the vessel they had fought so hard to save, disappeared into 3,000 fathoms of water and began her final descent to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. Men who had survived Coral Sea and Midway, who had watched the frantic repairs at Pearl Harbor, who had seen their ship refuse to die time after time, now watched her sink at last, and many of them wept openly. The Yorktown took with her 81 men who had been killed during the battle and torpedo attack, sailors and aviators who had died defending their ship and completing their mission. Their bodies would rest forever with the carrier they had served. But more than 2,000 men survived, rescued by the destroyers and cruisers that had screened the carrier during her last days. These survivors would go on to serve on other ships, would fight in other battles, would help win the war that the Yorktown had helped turn at Midway. They would carry with them forever the memory of the ghost carrier that refused to die, that appeared at Midway when the Japanese thought she was out of the fight, that struck the decisive blow even while mortally wounded herself. The battle had been won even as the Yorktown was lost. The 4 Japanese carriers that attacked Midway were all sunk, either during the battle itself or scuttled afterward. The Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Huryu all went to the bottom along with their highly trained aircrew and the accumulated experience of years of combat operations. Japan would build more carriers, but it could never replace the veteran pilots and crews lost at Midway. The balance of power in the Pacific had shifted permanently. Japan would never again possess the overwhelming superiority it had enjoyed in the first 6 months of the war. America would have time to build new carriers, train new pilots, and eventually overwhelm Japan with numbers and industrial might that the island nation could never match. The story of the USS Yorktown's 72-hour repair and her appearance at Midway became legendary throughout the American Navy and among the American public when the details were finally released after the battle. The repair workers at Pearl Harbor who had accomplished the impossible were recognized as having contributed directly to the victory at Midway, because without the Yorktown's air group, without her third carrier deck to launch and recover aircraft, without the additional striking power she provided, the outcome at Midway might have been very different. 2 American carriers against 4 Japanese carriers would have been even longer odds than the 3 against 4 that actually occurred. The dive bombers from the Yorktown had sunk one of the 4 Japanese carriers and contributed to the damage on the others. Her fighters had helped defend the fleet against Japanese counterattacks. Her presence had forced the Japanese to divide their attention among 3 American carrier groups instead of 2. The Japanese had made their battle plans based on faulty intelligence that assured them the Yorktown was out of action. When she appeared at Midway, it disrupted their calculations and added an unexpected element to the American forces. Some Japanese commanders later claimed they had been fighting 3 American carriers when they expected only 2, though they did not know until after the battle that one of those carriers was the Yorktown they believed they had disabled at Coral Sea. The ghost carrier had haunted them literally, appearing where she should not have been, striking when they did not expect her, refusing to die even when they thought they had killed her. In the end, they had finally sunk her, but by then the battle was already lost, and the cost of sinking her included the destruction of their own carrier fleet. The 72-hour miracle repair at Pearl Harbor became a case study in emergency shipyard work, in what could be accomplished when time was more important than perfection, when good enough was better than perfect if perfect meant arriving too late. The techniques developed during that desperate weekend, the willingness to use temporary shoring instead of permanent repairs, the acceptance of reduced capability if it meant getting back into action quickly, influenced American damage control and repair procedures for the rest of the war. Other damaged ships received similar emergency repairs that got them back into action in days or weeks rather than months. The culture of can-do problem-solving that the Pearl Harbor workers demonstrated became emblematic of American industrial might and engineering ingenuity applied to the problems of war. The Yorktown's name did not disappear when her hull sank beneath the Pacific waves. Just 4 months after her loss, in September 1942, the Navy commissioned a new Essex-class carrier with the name USS Yorktown CV-10 to honor the legacy of the lost carrier. This new Yorktown would go on to serve with distinction throughout the rest of World War II, earning 11 battle stars and participating in many of the major campaigns that drove Japan back across the Pacific. After the war, she served in the Atlantic recovered astronauts from the Apollo program and eventually became a museum ship at Patriots Point in Charleston, South Carolina, where she remains today as a testament to American naval aviation. Visitors walking her decks can see a carrier that bears the name and honors the legacy of the ghost carrier that appeared at Midway. The original Yorktown's wreck remained undiscovered on the ocean floor for nearly 50 years after she sank. In May 1998, an expedition led by the famous oceanographer Robert Ballard located the wreck lying upright on the bottom of the Pacific in more than 3 miles of water. Remarkably, the carrier was in relatively good condition considering her age and the depth at which she rested. Her hull was intact, her island superstructure still recognizable, her flight deck visible despite its wooden planking having long since rotted away or been consumed by marine organisms. The discovery allowed researchers to document the final resting place of one of the most famous carriers of World War II and provided a form of closure for survivors and their families who could now know exactly where their ship lay. The wreck site was designated as a war grave, protected under international law because of the men who died with the ship and whose remains still rest within her hull. No salvage operations are permitted, and the Yorktown will remain on the ocean floor undisturbed as a memorial to her crew and to all who served aboard her during her brief but extraordinary career. The images brought back by the underwater exploration revealed a ship that still showed signs of battle damage, still bore the scars of the torpedoes that finally sent her down, yet remained dignified even in death, a steel monument to determination and sacrifice lying in eternal darkness 3,000 fathoms down. The Battle of Midway, which the Yorktown helped win at the cost of her own life, marked the turning point of the Pacific War in ways that extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. Before Midway, Japan had been advancing seemingly without limit, conquering territory and defeating Allied forces across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. After Midway, Japan was strategically on the defensive for the rest of the war. The loss of 4 fleet carriers and their irreplaceable aircrew forced Japan to adopt defensive positions and attempt to hold the territory they had already conquered rather than continuing offensive operations. The initiative passed permanently to the Americans, who could now begin the long process of island hopping back across the Pacific toward Japan itself. The psychological impact of Midway was enormous for both sides. Americans, who had endured 6 months of almost constant bad news about retreats and defeats, suddenly had a clear and undeniable victory to celebrate. The Japanese, who had believed their armed forces were invincible and destined to establish a new order across Asia and the Pacific, suffered a shock from which their confidence never fully recovered. The Japanese government and military concealed the extent of the defeat from their own people, but the men who survived knew what had happened, knew they had been defeated by an American force they had expected to overwhelm, knew that the Americans had capabilities and determination that Japanese planners had underestimated. The industrial implications of Midway also became clear over time. America could replace the loss of the Yorktown and build dozens more carriers besides, drawing on industrial capacity that Japan could never match. Japan could build replacement carriers for those lost at Midway, but doing so required resources desperately needed for other purposes, and each new carrier came too late to affect the war's momentum. By the time Japan's replacement carriers were ready, American shipyards were launching new Essex-class carriers every few months, fast modern carriers that outclassed anything Japan could produce. The material advantage that America possessed, barely utilized in the early months of the war, began to assert itself with crushing force as the war continued. The story of the Yorktown's 72-hour repair and her final battle offers lessons that extend beyond the specific circumstances of 1942. It demonstrates what can be accomplished when people refuse to accept the limitations that normal circumstances impose, when they ask what is necessary rather than what is convenient, when they commit everything to accomplishing a goal that seems impossible. The 1,400 workers at Pearl Harbor did not debate whether the repair could be done in 72 hours. They accepted the mission and found a way to complete it. The Yorktown's crew did not argue that their ship was too badly damaged to fight. They sailed into battle and gave everything they had. Admiral Nimitz did not despair at facing a superior enemy force. He used every advantage he possessed, including intelligence, positioning, and timing, to create a situation where his outnumbered force could win. The determination displayed by everyone involved in the Yorktown's last mission reflected a broader American characteristic that would prove decisive throughout World War II. Americans approached problems with a pragmatic willingness to try unconventional solutions, to improvise when standard procedures did not work, to accept temporary or imperfect solutions if those solutions allowed them to keep moving forward. This flexibility and problem-solving mentality often contrasted with more rigid approaches from other nations that insisted on doing things by established procedures even when those procedures led to defeat. The willingness to patch the Yorktown with emergency repairs rather than insisting on perfect restoration exemplified this pragmatic approach to warfare. The human cost of this determination must also be acknowledged. 81 men died aboard the Yorktown during the battle and subsequent torpedo attacks. Many more were wounded. The sailors who survived watched their home and their ship sink beneath the waves carrying shipmates they would never see again. War demands terrible prices from those who fight it, and the victory at Midway came at a cost measured in lives and suffering that statistics alone cannot capture. Every carrier that sank, American or Japanese, took hundreds of men with it. Every aircraft shot down represented a young man who would never go home. The glory of victory and the importance of the strategic outcome do not erase the individual tragedies that accumulated to create the historical result. More than 80 years after the Battle of Midway, the story of the USS Yorktown continues to fascinate historians, naval enthusiasts, and anyone interested in tales of determination against impossible odds. Books have been written analyzing every aspect of the battle and the Yorktown's role in it. Documentaries have recreated the 72-hour repair and the carrier's final days. The discovery of her wreck sparked renewed interest in her story and brought it to the attention of new generations who had not lived through World War II. The Yorktown represents something fundamental in human nature: the refusal to surrender to fate, the determination to fight even when wounded, the commitment to duty that transcends personal survival. Part of the fascination comes from the dramatic nature of the story itself. The race against time, the impossible repair deadline, the appearance at the battle when the enemy thought the carrier was out of action, the stubborn refusal to sink even when mortally wounded, and the final tragic sinking just when it seemed she might be saved. It reads like fiction, like a story deliberately structured for maximum dramatic impact, yet it all actually happened exactly as described in the historical record. Reality provided a narrative arc that no novelist could improve upon, complete with setbacks, triumphs, reversals, and an ending that was simultaneously tragic and victorious, with the ship lost but the battle won. The human element adds depth to the drama. The 1,400 repair workers collapsing from exhaustion but continuing to work. The pilots pressing home attacks through walls of anti-aircraft fire. The damage control teams fighting fires and floods in the dark, while their ship shuddered under bomb and torpedo impacts. The destroyer crews rescuing sailors from the water while under submarine attack themselves. The admiral refusing to ask for more time even though he knew the repairs were inadequate. The captain staying with his damaged ship trying to save her even after ordering the crew to abandon. Every person involved in the Yorktown's story was an individual making choices and taking actions that contributed to the outcome, and their collective determination created something greater than any individual achievement. In the final analysis, the USS Yorktown's appearance at Midway after her impossible 72-hour repair may have been the single most important factor that allowed America to win that crucial battle. Without her, Nimitz would have faced the Japanese with only 2 carriers against 4, odds that even his intelligence advantage might not have overcome. With her, he had the minimum force necessary to execute the attack that destroyed the Japanese carrier fleet and turned the tide of the Pacific War. The ghost carrier that should not have been there struck the blow that changed history, and she did so because people refused to accept that repairing her in time was impossible. They made the impossible possible through determination, skill, and sheer willpower. The Yorktown's sacrifice bought time for America to mobilize its full industrial might. The defeat of the Japanese carriers at Midway prevented Japan from consolidating its conquests and gave America the breathing space to begin its counteroffensive. By the time the Yorktown sank, she had already ensured that the balance of naval power would shift permanently in America's favor. New carriers were already under construction, carriers that would be ready to fight because the Yorktown and her sisters had held the line long enough for reinforcements to arrive. The ghost carrier had appeared at the critical moment, struck the decisive blow, and absorbed punishment that might have fallen on other ships. Her presence at Midway was her finest hour and her last battle, and she made both count for everything they were worth. The story of the USS Yorktown reminds us that wars are not won by statistics or equipment alone, but by the determination of people who refuse to accept defeat. The 72-hour miracle at Pearl Harbor happened because people decided it would happen and worked until it did. The victory at Midway happened because commanders took calculated risks, pilots pressed home attacks against overwhelming odds, and ships kept fighting even when badly damaged. The Yorktown fought because her crew refused to give up on her, and because she was designed and built well enough to reward their determination by staying afloat and fighting back. Every system, every person, every decision contributed to the outcome, and the accumulation of all those individual contributions created a victory that no single element could have achieved alone. Today, the USS Yorktown rests on the floor of the Pacific Ocean 3,000 fathoms down, still on eternal patrol in the waters where she fought her last battle. Her steel hull has become an artificial reef supporting marine life in the deep ocean darkness. Her flight deck, once crowded with aircraft preparing for launch, now lies silent except for the occasional visit from deep-sea submersibles documenting her condition. The men who built her, repaired her, and fought aboard her have mostly passed away now, their stories preserved in historical records and the memories of their descendants. But the legacy of what they accomplished lives on in the history books, in the museums dedicated to World War II, and in the continuing fascination with the ghost carrier that appeared at Midway when the enemy thought she was dead. The Yorktown story teaches us that impossible is often just another word for difficult, that determination and ingenuity can overcome obstacles that seem insurmountable, and that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when the stakes are high enough and the need is great enough. The 1,400 shipyard workers who repaired her in 72 hours were not superhuman. They were skilled workers who simply refused to accept that the job could not be done in the time available. The pilots who flew from her deck were not invincible. They were young men, many of them barely out of training, who flew into combat because their country needed them to and because their shipmates depended on them. The crew who kept her fighting through multiple attacks were not fearless. They were sailors doing their jobs under terrifying circumstances because that was what sailors did. In an age that often celebrates individual achievement and personal success, the Yorktown story reminds us of the power of collective effort directed toward a common goal. No single person repaired the carrier in 72 hours. No individual pilot won the Battle of Midway. No lone sailor kept the ship fighting through bomb and torpedo attacks. All of it required thousands of people working together, trusting each other, supporting each other, and refusing to let each other down. The ghost carrier was not the work of any individual genius, but the product of a system that empowered ordinary people to do extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it.